here outside the home of Welsh Sports, the Principality Stadium in the centre of Cardiff, to present to you an interview with BBC Wales broadcasting legend Ed Bevan. He discusses a career over 4 decades, Welsh national rugby, Glamorgan, and also the incident where he made national and international newspapers where he got struck by a cricket ball in the commentary box for a 3rd time. So Edward, thank you for joining me here today. It's lovely to be down at Neath Cricket Club, where I'm sure you've got many memories. The knoll just behind us. Just firstly, you've had a long and illustrated broadcasting career. Firstly, how did you get into the industry 40 years ago?
Well, I played club cricket, and our club, which was Gowton Cricket Club near Swansea, got to the final of the National Village competition way back in the 70s, the 73 and 75. And as a consequence, I did a lot of interviews then for BBC Wales in both languages. And then after the second time we went up and won the competition, a couple of months afterwards, the producer, a gentleman by the name of Tom Davis of BBC Wales, senior radio producer, rang me up and said, have you been interested, or are you interested in doing some rugby commentary for us, as it was then getting into the autumn? I said, yes, I'm interested in doing rugby. Well, I'll give you a tape, he said. Go and do a local game, a village match, and then send the tape back to me. So I went, and people must have thought I was quite mad sitting in the car, jabbering away as if I was talking to myself, but it was actually the tape. Sent it back then to him, shall we say, at the end of September. Hadn't heard anything by early December. So I thought, well, that's that. It's an exercise done. But indeed, he rang me up and he said, the tape went well. I got you a game, Cardiff against Bristol, and you always remember your first game at the Arms Park in Cardiff. Pick up the machinery, as they call it then, the recording stuff and the commentating. And off I went, did it. He seemed quite pleased. And then from then on, it was bilingual. I did English and also in Welsh. And from there on, everything seemed to go all right. From there, I guess, well, I'll ask, was it ever in your mind before, I mean, I don't know what your career was beforehand, so maybe you can go into that, and, you know, was that ever something you were interested in, or was it just an avid interest in sport, and being bilingual, I assume, helped as well? It did help, because it was BBC Wales and also BBC Radio Cymru, which is the Welsh programme. Before that, I was a representative with the banking company, and I'd always been interested, very interested in playing sport and watching rugby, watching cricket and watching football, anything like that. So really, it was a dream come true. And as far as rugby was concerned, I did about 90 rugby internationals. And at that time, Radio 5 Live in London was starting up, and my colleague, who was a chap by the name of Ron Jones, he was a cricket correspondent and the football correspondent. He left to go up to London, and that gave me an opportunity. I was then roped in, as you like, as cricket correspondent, and, well, doing both sports, and it was quite busy because you finish in April doing rugby, then it was cricket. And eventually, when certain Glamorgan players were chosen for England, then I went for 10 years. I toured with England in the winter, so that was the end of the rugby. People like Greg Thomas and Robert Croft, Simon Jones, I went away on tours with them, which gave an interest, obviously, to the Welsh public. And that was that. I haven't done it recently because Glamorgan, I'm afraid, haven't produced any Test cricketers. But after that, it's been Glamorgan all the time, and I'm semi-retired now, but I still do a few games. I still enjoy it, but at least I don't have to run up and down the country doing about 15,000 miles a year. Yeah, well, it was obviously a long time, and like I said, when Glamorgan had that golden era, that sort of came as, like you said, a dream come true to be able to travel around and do that. I just wanted to ask about your sort of multi-sport sort of career. Like you said, cricket's the one that got you into it initially, the stroke of luck in the village knockout. But
How did you find reporting on other sports such as rugby and football in comparison to cricket, where you first got your chance?
Well, I've never done, although I have a great interest in football. I never did football. It was always rugby, and then cricket, as I say. And having played the two sports and a knowledge of the both sports, it was a great help. You had to, have a lot of research. You had to go into a lot of things before you, shall we say, a club match and see what players were playing, what was their history, and obviously that comes into it when you do your commentary. But I managed to switch over both sports and both languages. And it just developed from there. They were quite happy and I was happy. It was hard work, but thoroughly enjoyable.
And I suppose that's one of the things that's evolved over the years. I mean, journalism has changed massively over your career, I'm sure, but the bilingualism is something that Wales especially are trying to promote a bit more. And is that something you've noticed over your career?
Yes. I also, for 22 years, as a freelance at the time, I worked for the Daily Telegraph, which again was different to broadcasting, as you appreciate. And that was very, very enjoyable because that particular paper at the time had a reporter at every county match, both universities. So there was plenty of work. Sadly now, as you well know, it's the digital age and the papers don't bother a lot with cricket. And because if a story breaks, in the old days, if you were a journalist or a broadcaster, if, shall we say, the Glamorgan captain resigned overnight, then I get that story in. But now, if that happened in 2 seconds, it's on, and everybody can read it on your machine in a couple of seconds. So that has gone out of it, sadly. And it's not the same, because you go into press boxes now up and down the country, there's one or two people in there. Which is counteracted, I suppose, by the BBC doing ball by ball. It's very popular and keeps people interested, and they know up to date what's happening.
During that time, did you have a particular favourite between your time writing for the Telegraph or your live commentary? Because obviously now that you said it's sort of less of a thing, it's with the newspapers covering county cricket. I guess it's something you maybe wish you cherished more in the time. Did you have a particular favourite?
It was, I won't say difficult, very, very busy, because if you had a couple of orders and you had to write a couple of newspapers and do your BBC work, then you were there until about an hour after, or sometimes an hour and a half after play ended, because you had deadlines with newspapers, get reports in for the BBC, do interviews. But as a young man, you've got plenty of time and you've got the enthusiasm to do your job.
While we're on the topic of cricket and newspapers, you yourself, not as a player but as a commentator, you made a lot of the national tabloids probably about 13 years ago.
I know exactly what you're going to say,
yeah.
yes.
Would you like to refer to the incident down in Taunton and how
well,
it wasn't your first time either?
It wasn't, it was the third time. It happened twice at Cardiff. We had a small commentary box, not the palatial building it is now. And we were commentating, and it was a 40 over match, and it was getting towards the end of the first innings. And Courtney Walsh, it was, of all people, hit the ball, and I said, it's coming towards, and the next thing we heard a crash, and we ducked, and luckily, and exactly the same thing happened a couple of years later. But the one that went round the world, because I had calls from South Africa, Australia, was Glamorgan were playing down at Taunton against Somerset, and Peter Trigo was batting and going very well. Robert Croft was bowling, and Robert tossed this one up, and we were up in the gods, if you like, a long way over, long off, and unexpected. Trigo hit it hard, high, and that's exactly how I described it. It's coming towards us, and smash. And it hit me in the small of the back as it happened, because it was a tiny commentary box. And, it stung, but I managed to carry on after a few minutes. And I thought, well, 3 times, surely it can't happen again. And it didn't. But yes, that did make the news.
You've been fortunate. I mean, like I said, we're here at Neath Cricket Club, and you called Tom Bevan's 100, and we're not actually very far from the square here, so I'm sure you've had a couple of close calls.
I'm not very far, as you say. This where we're sitting now is the broadcasting and the press area for the 2 one-day games they play here. And Tom was hooking the ball from the middle of the square and pulling it away. And one went over, one hit the wall there of the pavilion, and one came and landed just a few yards in front of this area. And you know, it was good cricket and a wonderful innings by Tom, but you had to keep your wits about you.
With all your years of experience as well, how did you manage to keep yourself under control? I mean, I can imagine some less experience or people that maybe just think before they speak would have said something that wouldn't be allowed on air. How did you manage to keep your composure while still trying to duck for your life?
Very difficult because, you know, everybody, it slips out now and again, the odd swear word, but it never on air, of course. As you rightly say, that when that happened, you think, oh goodness, and you change it from oh something else, and oh crikey, and you know, it's experience that gives you that. And down in Taunton, where it was a very tiny box, you had to just turn your back. You couldn't duck or anything. But I suppose that happens, and you've got to live with it.
I just want to move on to now as well. You mentioned about the digital age earlier with the newspapers. In your experience, as I said, over a 40-year career, a lot's changed in the sense of technology. How do you think you've seen it and experienced it? Is it only the sense of county cricket losing its way from newspapers, or how have you found it's affected your career?
It hasn't affected my career at all, because as soon as this happened, the digital age, of course the BBC in conjunction with the ECB then decided to bring in ball-by-ball commentary. And it's been very, very popular, and I hope it'll go on for many, many years, because people can listen to it in their office. They can indeed watch it now because they've got the stream on their phones or their tablets or whatever. It's busy time for you've got to have free commentators going all the time, because it's very, very hard, busy work. But as I say, that has changed, because in the old days you do a news bulletin at 11, have a rest, watch the cricket, news bulletins 12, lunchtime, every hour. But now anybody who wants to listen, they just turn on anything they have and they can hear it.
And from your years and seeing through the changes of that, particularly in cricket and in newsrooms as well, I suppose you've got to have your wits about you, and it's a much more multi-skilled sort of scene now. What sort of budding advice would you give in that sense?
I would say, and I notice you've done it, that is to sit in with the commentary. If you ask permission to sit in with the commentators, sit at the back of the box even for an hour or so, and you can hear how the commentary develops, how somebody else will come in, and often we've had ex-cricketers, ex-county professionals sit in with us, especially in the T20 games, and that's as opposed to just describing the game. They've given insight of what it's like to be out there, and you develop a great understanding. I worked for 30 years with a wonderful man called Don Shepherd, who took over 2,000 wickets for Glamorgan in a career, and that was it was great to listen to his expertise, not in broadcasting, but of course in telling you what it is like to bowl, what it is like to bat, and the atmosphere out on the ground.
Obviously, you've worked with Nick Webb for a long time as sort of co-correspondent for BBC Wales covering Glamorgan, but how, like you mentioned there, how do you find the connection you get to build with players when you're interviewing them at every game, or as you say, working with them in broadcasting after their career as well?
That can be a little tricky, and I think you might have seen it with football players. If they have not a particularly good game, and you're going to think, well, but normally we don't interview those people. We interview people who's got 100, if they're taking 5 wickets, if they're in exceptionally well. They're in a good mood, we're in a good mood, because you can't criticise or anything like that. And what I tend to do is, if I interview somebody, is well, if he was out, you might say, well, you weren't very happy with that shot, well, you wouldn't have been very happy, and he'd admit, no, it wasn't. And it goes on like that.
From your time covering Glamorgan as well, I mean, just want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned earlier about the lack of test players now compared to when you were lucky to tour the world in the golden age. What do you sort of see the going forward as with Glamorgan? Because you're right, rightfully so, it has been a long time since Simon Jones, the last Glamorgan player or Welsh player to represent England in the test format, and the 90s when there were so many of them. How have you seen that change over the time?
Well, sadly, things have gone downhill because, as you say, Simon Jones was the last one, the last player, and that goes back many years. And it's a disappointment to a lot of people in Wales that Welsh people seem to be coming through, which is very unfortunate. I don't think there's a player on the staff from West Wales, again, which is a disappointment. And their form in recent years, apart from one season a couple of years ago, has not been particularly good. And I think members get a little bit restless and think, well, when are we going to develop an ex-Tex player? When are Glamorgan going to win a championship? When are they going to win a one-day cup? They did do it 3 years ago, but that was more or less a second 11 cup because it coincided with the 100.
And you mentioned lack of representative players from various places in Wales. Obviously, we're here at Neath. There's 2 one-day cup games here this year, but no county championship cricket anywhere outside of Sapphire Gardens. When they've lost games from Colwyn Bay, where they were in the past, Neath, Swansea, going back many years. How do you see that as a sort of a loss of identity now, and with an English captain as well? Do you feel the sort of Welsh identity in Glamorgan is failing?
Well, many people would say that, and you have to agree now and again because of the influx of so many players from other counties. Counties lend you players; they come on loan. But going back to your question, as you say, as a young lad growing up, I used to come here with my father and watch 4-day matches. Used to go to Swansea, and there were places like Pontypridd, they played, Llanelli. But it becomes very difficult now because of all the advertising boards you see at Cardiff. Those have got to be transported. The pitch has got to be good. You've got to get chairs down there so that people can watch the game, all sorts of things. And it's quite a large expense. And when you've got a ground, as Glamorgan are still paying it off, you want to play all your games, if you can, in Cardiff. And that, I think, is the reason that Glamorgan can't go to any of these clubs, although Swansea, I'm afraid, has deteriorated because there's no money being put in by the local council, which is rather sad. And it's just, you're making a loss, if you like, if you go to the smaller clubs.
So do you just see the future there being in Cardiff, and that's what it's going to be, and what Glamorgan fans may have to accept? But
as we talk here in Neath, and they hadn't played here for many years, the council, the local council, as they did in Colwyn Bay, they put in some money. And if you have to play in these, or if you want to, then you've got to have help from outside the club. Otherwise, it's not a viable product to carry on with.
Just to move away from cricket, something else you're very actively spoken about on Twitter, or X as it's now known, is Welsh Rugby. Obviously, as you said, you covered it, 90 internationals over your long career. That's another area that's changed so much, similarly to Glamorgan, and fallen off, if you will. The Six Nations not successful this year. Where do you see that going forward?
Well, I suppose it's all to do with money, because if you can't play, as the game is, it didn't used to be in my day, is professional, and if you can't get the money to pay these players, they'll go off to play in France, in England, and you've got to have played a certain number of times for Wales, and if you're abroad, they won't pick you. And that's a contentious thing at the moment. And Welsh Rugby hasn't been very well run. There's been crisis, there's been a lot of things going wrong. The chief executive has gone recently, half the committee, the chairman have gone. It's been problematical. And all these leagues now it's totally different to what in the old days. If you had Swansea playing Neath in the ground behind us here, you'd have a packed house. Now, those clubs are playing in lower divisions, and it's all the various counties, if you like. The Ospreys, an amalgamation, and if you look at the URC Championship at the moment, I think nearly all the Welsh clubs are in the bottom 6.
And just to wrap up, obviously the autumn internationals were announced a couple of weeks ago. The lack of Georgia in there, which I think a lot of people maybe wanted or didn't want for a potential humiliation as the sort of playoff between the Six Nations and the division below sort of arises in conversations more often. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think it's very sad that Georgia, when I say it's very sad, you can look at it both ways. Georgia have done so well in recent years, and perhaps they should come into it. But years ago, you see, it was just the home countries, and that was that, the home series, if you like. But now it's developed. France came into it, and South Africa want to come into it. But if it goes on and on, I think it gets out of hand. But I'm sorry that Georgia are not involved next autumn. The Welsh Rugby Union, I think, said, well, we haven't got time. And what they think about is who's going to put the money in now, and are they going to get sponsorship? Are they going to get the crowds? It's all about money. All sport now, I'm afraid, is money.
Well, thank you, Ed Wood, for joining me. And,
Pleasure.
And great to hear your thoughts on that. Well, I'm back outside the Principality Stadium in the centre of Cardiff after my first ever trip to the Knoll in Neath. And it was a great chance to speak to Ed Bevan about his illustrious career within the BBC, and also the topics of Glamorgan and Welsh Rugby, and the comedic incident of when he got struck by a cricket ball for the 3rd time in his career.